everyone, so thank you so much for coming. We've got a great turnout, and hopefully you guys are enjoying the newest addition to the very fierce, surprisingly, Lawrence Chicken Market. We've got Zaxby's in the back, so hopefully those of you with a few southern ties are feeling a little bit more like you're at home now. We couldn't do Chick-fil-A every time. Actually, we could, but we had an Atlantan here who demanded we do Zaxby's. So
it's the only logical thing.
That's fair. That's fair. Today we've got two very, very impressive speakers here to talk about school choice and how that affects religious liberty. And so, without further ado, I want to introduce Professor. It's Sherman S. Welpton Jr. and Warren R. Wise, Professor of Law. He's been at the University of Nebraska College of Law for nearly 30 years.
That's my title, not my name.
Professor Rick Duncan. I was given the title first.
Okay.
But he's been at Nebraska for nearly 30 years. He's a graduate of Cornell Law School, where his daughter now currently attends.
Yep.
And please join me in giving him a nice, warm KU welcome.
Yeah, I'm the Welpton and Wise Professor of Law, and I've tried to negotiate with the dean to drop the Welpton part so I could be the Wise Professor of Law. I thought that would be extra special, but not to be. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Lawrence, and really enjoyed getting to know the town a little bit. It's a wonderful college town. It's got a little bit of the feel of San Francisco in the summer of love in the late 60s. And I enjoyed the summer of love very much, and it's nice to be reminded of it here in Lawrence. I'm not here to be a policy wonk and to tell you about how school choice produces higher SAT scores and better math and science education. I think competition is always good for the quality of any service or commodity, whether widgets or K through 12 education. But that's not my charge today. My charge today is the following. Resolved. School choice is necessary for religious liberty, freedom of thought, and equal educational opportunity. Let me say at the outset, I'm not here to attack public schools or public school teachers or administrators. I have 5 children. 4 of them went through private religious schools, and 1 of them graduated from Lincoln Southwest Public High School in the class of 2013. So I have experience and recent experience with both public and private education, and I know there are good people in both systems, people who care deeply about students and who, quite frankly, are underpaid. I think public schools are one option. They work well for some, perhaps for many families. My beef is with the government school monopoly over educational funding and with the one-size-fits-all approach to K through 12 education, not with public schools or the people who work in public schools. So my charge today is to try to convince you, or at least to hope that you'll think about, whether religious liberty, freedom of thought and belief, and equal opportunity in education are served by public school choice, by which I mean equal per-pupil funding for the education of each child at a school of his or her family's choosing. And much of my focus today is on school choice and religious liberty. I'm a First Amendment scholar, but I believe that the best way to protect religious liberty is to protect liberty for everyone by minimizing the power of the government over our lives, our beliefs, and our families. Liberty for all is liberty for each one. So my approach today is to look at school choice from a libertarian perspective. But let's start by talking about how difficult it is for religious families to educate their children in contemporary secular America. And let me tell you a true story. I'll tell you some lies later, but let me start with a true story. A number of years ago, I was asked to speak to a large young parent Sunday school class at a church back home in Lincoln, Nebraska. There must have been about 140 young parents of school age, of children who were approaching school age. And the pastor who invited me wanted me to help these Christian parents think through their options for educating their children: public school, homeschool, Christian school. So on the scheduled date, I walked into the room and explained that since I'm a law professor, I ask questions, I don't answer questions. Immediately won their support. So I asked several questions. First question, how many of you young Christian parents wish to educate your children in a curriculum that reflects the mind of Christ? Now, how many of these young Christian parents do you think raised their hands? Right, all of them. Every one of them raised their hands. Then I asked my second question. How many of you believe that the public school curriculum here in Lincoln, Nebraska reflects the mind of Christ? Now how many do you think raised their hands? Not a single one. So my third question, cut to the quick. I wasn't kind. You know, I played the Socratic game with them, and I said, well, why did you, I sort of went into my Detective Columbo, confused detective impression, and I said, well, why did you even bother to invite me here to help you think through this decision? It seems like you've already decided that public schools are not what you want for your children. And in frustration, some of them shouted out, but we can't afford to send our children to private religious schools. You told me what you want. You told me, why you can't achieve what you want. And that's the rub. The selective funding of education in secular government schools guarantees religious inequality in America. It imposes on religious parents, and frankly, any parent whose wishes are not served by the public schools, whose educational choices are not served by the public schools. But we'll stick with religious parents for now. It imposes on religious parents what even supporters of public schools call a brutal bargain. They must choose between the single largest benefit most families receive from government, free education for their kids from K through 12, and they either choose that or assimilation of their children into a dominant secular culture by means of a governmental institution that exists for the very purpose of inculcating so-called common secular values. It is a brutal bargain indeed. Now, as I prepared for this talk, actually I've given this talk in past years as well, so it was a few years ago when I kind of ran the math. I decided to do the math for someone in my situation. So I have 5 children. And the average per student funding for K through 12 education, conservatively, is at least $10,000 per year. It's higher in a lot of places, but let's use the conservative figure, $10,000. So $10,000 times 5 children times 13 years equals $650,000. That is the penalty someone like me would pay for educating their children in private religious schools. If I send them to public schools, I get a $650,000 worth of scholarships. If I send them to private religious schools, I lose every penny. Yet I still pay a lifetime of taxes to pay for public schools. Well, more than a century ago, John Stuart Mill, an atheist, by the way, warned about the danger of allowing government to direct the education of children in his classic defense of individual freedom on liberty. Mill explained that government schools are inherently destructive of religious liberty and freedom of thought. Here's what Mill said: a general state education is a mere contrivance for molding people to be exactly like one another. And as the mold in which it casts them is that which pleases the predominant power in the government, whether this be a monarch, a priesthood, an aristocracy, or the majority of the existing generation, in proportion as it is efficient and successful, it establishes a despotism over the mind, leading by natural tendency to one over the body. Despotism over the mind, says Mill. Instead of schools run by the government, Mill supported what he called diversity of education and parental choice. The government school monopoly is a propagandist stream. Again, I'm not saying they teach propaganda, but it's a propagandist stream. They have a captive audience of impressionable children, and these children have been told to pay attention and to master the lessons they are taught, because their success in life depends upon how well they master those lessons. Even a devout Christian parent, such as one from the Sunday school class that I mentioned, sending her children off to a secular public school, tells them to pay attention and to master the lessons they are being taught. Well, in Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the Supreme Court unanimously struck down an Oregon law requiring all school children to attend public school as violating the right of parents to direct the upbringing and education of their children, and echoed Mill's point about despotism over the mind. By the way, that mandatory public school attendance law was supported by the Oregon Ku Klux Klan. You might ask yourself why they might support that, and who was going to private schools in around 1920 in America, Catholics probably. So it was probably a lot of anti-Catholic bigotry that was behind this law. But the court unanimously struck it down, and here's what Justice McReynolds said on behalf of a unanimous court. And this, by the way, is one of the most famous and eloquent passages in legal history. If I ever get a tattoo, this might be what I tattoo on my arm. The fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children, there's Mill, by forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only. The child is not the mere creature of the state. Those who nurture him and direct his destiny, parents, have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations. Well, the public schools are indeed designed to mold the minds and hearts of children in the shape of a one-size-fits-all common curriculum. You ever heard of the melting pot and how we get to the melting pot? We melt people down and then we pour them into an American mold. A curriculum that is strictly secular and which in many respects today is contrary to the Judeo-Christian understanding of what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. Indeed, the legal rules governing public schools are weighted heavily against families with serious religious faith, because we are not permitted to use the political process to seek inclusion of our beliefs or perspectives into the common curriculum. And this is so because under the prevailing Supreme Court interpretation of the Establishment Clause, public schools may endorse secular beliefs and perspectives, but they may not endorse religious beliefs or perspectives. That would violate the Establishment Clause. So we can't even use everyone else is free to use the political process to get their ideas and their values into the textbooks, into the public school curriculum, but religious people are prevented from doing so by the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Establishment Clause. So religious parents understand that a secular education is neutral toward religion, only in the sense that it marginalizes all religious perspectives about what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. No religious perspectives come in, so all religious perspectives are treated equally, but they're not treated equally as against secular perspectives. It's Professor Michael McConnell, Judge Michael McConnell for a while, now back to Professor Michael McConnell of Stanford Law School, has put it so well. A secular school does not necessarily produce atheists, but it produces young adults who inevitably think of religion as extraneous to the real world of intellectual inquiry, if they think of religion at all. And even liberal legal scholars, such as my good friend Sandy Levinson of University of Texas Law School, agree that public schools, quoting Sandy, regularly articulate, clothed in the full symbolic and actual authority of the state, highly contestable and completely unneutral views on important political and cultural matters. Levinson also acknowledges that competing versions of the truth are thus drowned out by the superior resources of the state. And he concludes that it is quite naive to believe that government schools are neutral. So conservative law professor Michael McConnell, government schools are not neutral. Liberal law professor Sandy Levinson, one of the great scholars in legal academia, public schools are not neutral. In a free and just society, government has no business commandeering an audience of impressionable children for inculcation in the ideas, beliefs, perspectives, and attitudes of those who temporarily hold the reins of power. The Supreme Court likes to say that the First Amendment provides absolute protection